Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lecture 4 in our Brain and Behavior course. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the peripheral nervous system and the spinal cord. So last time we were talking about the brain and the structure of the brain, how the brain is put together, what its parts are, what those parts do, in sort of a big picture sense, what kind of information they process, what things they respond to, why they're important. Uh, in a later unit, we'll talk about how individual neurons work in terms of generating activity and signaling. But for now, what we're going to do is stick with this sort of large-scale structure and talk about not the brain, but the spinal cord, which obviously connects to the brain, and the peripheral nervous system, which is basically everything else. So we've already mentioned how there's a distinction between the central and peripheral nervous systems, which are often abbreviated CNS and PNS, respectively. And the central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord together. And just because there's so much to talk about with the brain itself, I made the brain one unit and then the spinal cord, which is actually also part of the CNS, I've put in this unit with the peripheral nervous system. But the spinal cord is part of the central nervous system. It's just to balance out the length of these topics that I've done this. So I'll start by talking about the cranial nerves. And the cranial nerves are almost all of them are part of the peripheral nervous system. And these are nerves that come off of the brain and come off of the brain stem. Now, when we get into the structure of the spinal cord, which is coming up next, we'll see that there are lots of nerves going into and out of the spinal cord. And these carry signals that have to do with sensory input, motor output, so sensing the environment and moving. But before we get to the spinal cord, we're sort of going to start at the top. And the spinal cord is, of course, connected to the brainstem. But the brainstem itself actually has nerves that come out of it. And the brain itself does as well. And so these are the cranial nerves. And these carry information just as the peripheral nervous system nerves that come out of the spinal cord do. And again, most of the cranial nerves are part of the peripheral nervous system, even though they come out of the brain to the brainstem. There are two exceptions, the olfactory nerve and the optic nerve. You've probably heard of the optic nerve. It's what carries visual signals from the eyes to the brain. And the olfactory nerve carries information about smell, so it carries signals coming from your nose. And those signal the presence of odors. Now, those two nerves are cranial nerves. They're actually part of the central nervous system. They come off of the brain itself. They have special structures we'll get into in a minute. But the rest of them are peripheral nerves. Anyway, the point here, and the point of this diagram, is not for you to memorize the names of all the cranial nerves or even their numbers. That's not what we're doing here. The point here is if you look at this diagram, you see combinations of blue and red lines coming off of these structures, these cranial nerves. And what that indicates is that cranial nerves carry both motor and sensory information. So, for example, the olfactory and optic nerves, they're color-coded blue in this diagram. They carry sensory information to the brain. So it's sort of a one-way street. There's information about smell. There's information about vision coming into the brain. So those carry sensory information. Just to the right of them on this diagram are three of the muscles that control the movement of the eye. And so they're color-coded red because those control muscles. Those are outgoing signals that tell the eye where to point. And I'm not going to exhaust this whole list of cranial nerves. You can go all the way around and see all the things that these nerves do. But you'll see that some of these actually are both red and blue. So some of these nerves carry both information to the brain, if it's sensory information, and information from the brain. It's outgoing, carries motor signals. And these nerves have to do with hearing, with taste, with smell, and also the movement of muscles in the head, whether it's the tongue, the jaw, neck. So they do a variety of things, and most of them have to do with sensory and motor functions within the head. But again, the point here is not to memorize all their names or functions, just to be aware that they have both sensory and motor functions, that there are many of them, that they're part of the peripheral nervous system, again, except for the olfactory and optic nerves. Okay, on to the spinal cord. So the spinal cord, of course, is encased within the spine, within vertebrae, which are bones, that are all linked together. Spinal cord, being consisting of neurons, is pretty fragile. That's why you have these bones around it to protect it. Spinal cord is very easy to injure, and if an impact is severe enough, of course, the bones aren't quite enough, and you can get a spinal cord injury. We'll talk about more about that in a second here. But we see here the spinal cord, and we see cross sections going down from what we call the cervical, that is having to do with the neck vertebrae, down to the sacral, having to do with the tailbone vertebrae. And so the cross section changes a little bit, and we'll see why here in a minute. For now, I want you to pay more attention to the diagram on the right. So looking at the anatomy, not of the entire spinal cord, but it's pulling out a section. And we're going to look at a couple of components of the spinal cord. And in particular, what I want you to look at are these three layers of tissue that surround the spinal cord. They are the pia mater, the arachnoid, and the dura mater. And it's not a typo. It's not supposed to be mater. It is mater. It's Latin. And so mater is Latin for mother. And pia and dura mean soft and tough or hard, respectively. So the idea here is that these coverings, these membranes, protect the spinal cord and nourish it. So you have the soft mother and you have the hard mother or tough mother. And then in between them, you have the arachnoid layer. We're not going to go into the detailed functions of these things, but they do protect the spinal cord. And together, they are known as the meninges, which is the word you see to the right of them here. And if you've ever heard of the disease meningitis, it's this layer, this protective layer, that gets inflamed and infected. But normally, they serve a very important function. They protect the brain and the spinal cord. So you find the meninges, these membranes, on the central nervous system, but not the peripheral nervous system. And that's one of the important distinctions between the two. In fact, that's sort of the dividing line, is once nerves exit the meninges or are no longer covered by them, then you're in the peripheral nervous system. And it's one more reason that the olfactory and optic nerves are cranial nerves, but they're part of the CNS because they are protected by meninges, whereas the other cranial nerves are not. Okay, so we have these three layers that protect the spinal cord, known as the meninges. If we take a close-up look at a cross-section of the spinal cord, again, we're going to go into more detail here in a minute, but for now, I want you to pay attention to these things that are coming off the spinal cord. And these are nerves, and on the top part of the diagram, you see the ventral roots, which are labeled parentheses motor. And so those are nerves that are exiting the spinal cord, and they're responsible for carrying motor information out to the muscles. And then what I've circled here is what's called the dorsal root ganglion. So you have dorsal roots, which go into the spinal cord, carry sensory information. So again, we have that dual system where we have sensory information going toward the CNS and motor information leaving the CNS. So input goes in, output goes out. So the ventral roots carry motor signals, and as we already know now, ventral means toward the stomach. And so if this is the spinal cord that we're looking at, we're kind of looking at it from behind. So those ventral roots are farther away from us. They're coming out on the stomach side of the spinal cord. The dorsal roots, we know dorsal means back, so those are closer to the surface of the back. So that's where they exit the spinal cord. And the dorsal root ganglion, the ganglion is really a lump of cell bodies. That's what a ganglion is. And we'll see what that consists of soon. But for now, just pay attention to this bulge that contains part of the dorsal roots. So those nerves, those sensory nerves that are coming out of the spinal cord and they're really carrying sensory information into the spinal cord. but you see them sort of sticking out of the spinal cord. And they stick out periodically between the vertebrae. So the vertebrae, again, are those bones that link together and make up the spine. And of course, because it's solid bone, the nerves can't get through that. They can't get through the vertebrae. So they have to exit between them. It's sort of like on and off ramps on a highway. They're not all over the place. Every so often, there's an opportunity to get on or get off. And that's the same setup here. So the spinal cord has nerves that leave and nerves that enter, but not randomly. These nerves enter and exit between the vertebrae. So you have many dorsal root ganglia, you have many ventral roots, and they exit between the vertebrae. And over here, this is a diagram that's not from your book. But the reason all this is important is that it's going to tell us, for example, if an injury occurs, we can figure out where the injury is based on the sensory and motor information that's still intact. So as I mentioned, a traumatic injury to the spine can damage the spinal cord. And at any point in the spinal cord, as you're moving, for example, toward the head, any point is going to have all the information that enters at that point, so those ganglia, and also all the information from below that point in the body. So in neck injury, if the spinal cord is injured at the level of the neck, not only do you lose the input and outputs that correspond to the neck, you lose everything from that point down. And that's color-coded here on this diagram at the very top. So a spinal cord injury at the level of the neck is very damaging, very devastating, because not only do you lose the neck, you lose the ability to control and sense the arms, the torso, and the legs. Whereas an injury to the middle of the spinal cord, if you look further down in this diagram, you might lose part of the torso in terms of being able to sense and move it, and lose the legs. So we're talking about a loss of function, but the farther down the injury is, the less function will be lost. And the reason that is that lower you are in the spinal cord, that location in the spinal cord will correspond to that level, that elevation, so to speak, but also everything below it. Because everything that has to do with the limbs, the torso, the legs, all that information enters the spinal cord. And it travels up toward the brain. And so if you sever the spinal cord, all the information on the side away from the brain is going to be lost. And so that's why the location of the injury makes a huge difference for what function will be retained or lost. And it's also why you can use this diagnostically. So if someone can feel their legs, cannot feel their legs, but can feel their arms, well, you know it's not a cervical injury. If they can feel their shoulders, but not their arms, their torso, or their legs, then that injury is higher up. So we can use that diagnostically, and that's one reason why that's important. So this is what I'll call a basic wiring diagram. So how do we get sort of from point A to point B? How do we get from a sense organ, in this case the skin, up to the brain so it can be processed? So over on the far right, we have skin. We have receptors in the skin. I'll talk more about the senses soon, but for now, just know that information is conveyed from these sense organs through sensory neurons to the spinal cord. And so that's carried up. So once it gets into the spinal cord, it starts to go up because it's got to get to the brain. Once it gets to the part of the brainstem called the medulla, it crosses over. So we've already seen how motor cortex on one side of the brain controls the opposite side of the body, and somatosensory cortex on one side of the brain responds to the opposite side of the body. So your left somatosensory cortex registers sensation for the right side of your body. So obviously the neurons have to cross over somewhere because the sense organs are on the right. The brain, the part of the brain that corresponds to that sense organ is on the left. There's got to be a crossing point, and that crossing point is the medulla. And so this is a diagram from your book. You can see the neurons traveling upward toward the brain. They sort of stop in the medulla. They cross over the midpoint, And now they're on the same side as the appropriate portion of somatosensory cortex. So if this is, for example, a sense organ on the right side of the body, it enters on the right side of the spinal cord. It goes up the right side of the spinal cord. Once it gets to the medulla, it crosses over to the left side and then travels up to the brain through the thalamus. So so we have a better understanding of how we have what we call contralateral organization, how we have one side of the brain responding to or controlling the opposite side of the body. And this is true for the motor system as well. So if you're talking about muscles on the right side of the body, the neurons that go out to those muscles and send signals to them will cross over in the medulla as well. And this bears sort of an eerie resemblance to Descartes' original diagram from hundreds of years ago. And of course, Descartes was wrong in a lot of ways. He thought there was sort of a spiritual fluid that traveled up the tube and went into this part of the brain that has nothing to do with sensation. But the idea of conveying a signal from a distant part of the body going up the spinal cord and into the brain, that part was right. And as sort of an added detail, it crosses over. Descartes didn't mention that part, he didn't know it, but it is true. So you have this signal that travels up from, in this case, the foot, up the leg, into the spinal cord, and after crossing over, up into the brain. So last time we talked about the distinction between white matter and gray matter. And we know that the distinction structurally at the level of neurons depends on myelin. So white matter has myelin around the axons, gray matter does not. And gray matter tends to not have myelin because it's not traveling a long distance. Those axons are not going to some distant part of the nervous system. Gray matter usually consists of neurons that are talking locally. They have a lot of synapses with their neighbors nearby. Whereas white matter, it has those myelinated axons, but it needs to transmit information a long distance, and it wants that insulation for extra speed. It has to go a long way. The faster, the better. And so we have that distinction between gray matter and white matter in the spinal cord as well. So this is not from your book, but if you look at this diagram, this cross-section of the spinal cord, the inner part, the sort of forked-looking structure, that's gray matter. The outer part is white matter. So that surrounding part, the white matter, consists of axons that have come in at some lower part of the spinal cord, and now that information is just being carried upward as quickly as possible and a long distance, so you want myelin. The gray matter in the spinal cord is doing the local processing. We're about to get to reflexes, where there is often some processing involved in the spinal cord itself. And so the gray matter at a given location in the spinal cord is processing sensory and motor information for those roots that are entering and exiting at that location. So gray matter tends to stay relatively constant in terms of amount of gray matter along the spinal cord, because there's always something to be processed in that location. But as you go up, there's more and more white matter in the spinal cord. Why is that? Well, it's because at the very bottom of the spinal cord, there isn't much white matter because there aren't really any neurons below that point that need to send information up. But if you go all the way up to the neck, for example, you have the gray matter that processes information that has to do with the neck, so the local information. But all of that white matter is axons that are coming up from all the lower parts of the body. So the higher up you go, you have proportionally more white matter because you have proportionally more of the body represented, sending information up to the brain. It's sort of like a highway system. If you have a highway system going to the middle of downtown, then it goes all the way out to rural areas that are smaller, first of all, but also traffic coming in at those rural areas that's trying to get downtown. You go halfway up that highway, you have cars coming in, and they're all trying to get downtown. So the highway gets bigger and bigger as you go toward downtown because it has to carry a larger and larger volume. And sure, there are going to be some cars that exit and enter the highway sort of locally. Maybe they're on for an exit or two. But most of those are trying to get all the way to the middle of the city. And so you have more and more lanes to carry the extra traffic, and you have more and more information, people in our metaphor here, going to downtown, which is our metaphorical central nervous system. So that's a metaphor that can be helpful. Why does the spinal cord get bigger? Why is there more white matter the closer to the brain you get? Well, it's because the closer to the brain you get, more and more information is not local, it's sort of the express lane getting to the brain as fast as it can. So that's why it's white matter. Okay, divisions within the nervous system. So there's what's called the autonomic nervous system. And the biggest feature of the autonomic nervous system are two opposing systems called the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. The sympathetic nervous system has nothing to do with the emotion of sympathy. It deals with what's often called your fight or flight response. So if there's something threatening or something alarming, you may notice that, for example, your heart rate goes up. You breathe faster. It may be easier to breathe. Your airways open up. Your pupils dilate. And so all of those physiological responses are the effect of the sympathetic nervous system. Once it activates, and it's activated by the brain, it sends signals to organs in your body. It frees up sugar so that your muscles can be more active. It opens up your airways. It increases your heart rate and your blood pressure. And what it also does is it shuts down your digestive system, among others. And so the idea here of fight or flight is that if there's a threat there, if there's a threat in your environment somewhere, you want to be ready for action. Whether you're running away, whether you're going to be engaged in combat, either way, you want your senses to be highly acute. You want to be moving nutrients around and oxygen around your body, supplying your muscles with the air, the oxygen, and the energy they need. You want to be ready to do something. And so that's why your heart rate goes up. That's why your airways expand, trying to get more oxygen to your blood. And if you do have an immediate threat, you don't really need to worry about digestion for a while. So let's not send blood, let's not spend energy on digestion. That's a long-term process. And so the idea of fight or flight, the idea of the sympathetic nervous system, is that it allows you to survive right now when you're under a threat. So all of those responses are all aimed at the goal of survival. Now, of course, you don't stay in that mode permanently. There is the opposing system, the parasympathetic nervous system. And it does exactly the opposite of the sympathetic nervous system. It's sometimes referred to as rest and digest. You've probably heard of fight or flight. You might not have heard of rest and digest. But it is the counterpart. And so it slows down the heart rate. It constricts the airways. It constricts the pupil. So it allows you to store energy. It also lets you resume digestion. So this is sort of the long-term system. There's not an immediate threat. You don't need to spend a bunch of energy with an elevated heart rate. You don't need to release a bunch of sugar to the muscles. It's time to digest. It's time to spend less energy. You don't want to spend more energy than you need to in an evolutionary perspective. When we get to a later unit, we'll see that our bodies have evolved to conserve energy, even though energy is pretty plentiful in our current society. Anyway, your parasympathetic nervous system opposes the sympathetic, slows things down, lets you digest things again. So you have these two components of the autonomic nervous system. And of course, these are not voluntary. You do not control consciously your heart rate, your breathing rate, your pupil diameter. You don't have any control over that, but your autonomic nervous system does. Okay. So one important thing that the spinal cord is involved in are reflexes. So these are mediated by the spinal cord. That is, they go through the spinal cord. Not the brain, just the spinal cord. And that's why they're so fast. In fact, when we think of something being a reflex, what we usually mean is it's very quick. And it's also, at least in the old view, inflexible. What does that mean? Well, it means you don't consciously control it. It happens very quickly. It happens before you even thought about it. And again, this is true to a certain degree, but the old view was that your brain is not involved at all. That this just goes to your spinal cord, and it is quick because it doesn't have to go all the way up to your brain and back. But your spinal cord doesn't really think very much. It processes information in a very limited way. And so it doesn't consider the environment. If it gets a certain sensory signal, it sends a motor output. Easy, quick, but not very flexible. And so the classic example here is the patellar reflex. And you've probably undergone this procedure in a doctor's office. But when the doctor uses that little rubber hammer and taps just below your kneecap, your knee kicks out, or your leg kicks out. So your foot goes forward. Why? Well, it's a reflex. You don't think about it. It's controlled by your spinal cord. And the reason that reflex is there is it doesn't want your muscles to get overstretched. And so when the hammer taps on that tendon, the muscle gets stretched pretty quickly. And as a protective measure, that muscle will flex, it will contract to keep it from getting too long, because when you tap the tendon, it stretches out the muscle. But the muscle is the reflex is there to protect the muscle, and it contracts the muscle to counteract that lengthening. So that's the patellar reflex, and it's very simple. So what happens? So there are sense organs, we're not going to go into the details for this, in the muscle that detect the length of the muscle. And if it gets stretched, then that information is carried by a sensory neuron, which I've put a box around here. And the sensory neuron goes into the spinal cord. Now you see this in this diagram, this is not from your book. You see a little sort of circle, like a lollipop sticking out of a sensory neuron. That circle represents the cell body. And so the dendrites are going into the muscle. The axon goes into the spinal cord. So if that muscle gets stretched, the dendrites feel that. They send a signal down the dendrites, past the cell body, down the axon into the spinal cord. And then a couple things happen. The first is that that muscle that's being stretched, it contracts. So the sensory neuron actually has a synapse on the motor neuron in the spinal cord. And so it sends that motor signal. So this is now a second neuron that's involved. It sends that motor output back out to the muscle, tells the muscle to contract. So that's kind of a closed loop. You have two neurons there. You have the sensory neuron sending a signal to the motor neuron. They have a synapse together. And that's how the sensory information gets from the sensory neuron to the motor neuron. Now what's interesting here is that muscles come in pairs. So in this case, your quadriceps, the muscle on top of your thigh, that's what contracts in the patellar reflex. But that would only work if your hamstring, the lower muscle of your thigh, if that didn't contract. If you contract both muscles at once, that leg's not going anywhere. So in order for that leg to go somewhere, in order for that muscle on top to shorten, you have to relax that bottom muscle, relax that hamstring. And so there is another synapse the sensory neuron has on an interneuron, and that interneuron then inhibits that hamstring muscle. It inhibits the motor neuron that goes to the hamstring. What does that do? Well, it means that when that sensory neuron is active, when that muscle gets stretched, the sensory neuron sends a signal both to the muscle, the motor neuron controlling the quadricep, saying, hey, contract, and it sends a signal to an interneuron, which then inhibits or shuts down the motor neuron going to the hamstring. So that one signal from that sensory neuron contracts the quadricep with one motor neuron and also inhibits the opposing muscle. It keeps it from contracting. So it sends a signal to an interneuron, and because the hamstring is now relaxed and the quadriceps is contracted, you get that knee-jerk reaction. And that's where we get that expression, the knee-jerk reaction, something quick, automatic, but doesn't really consider context, doesn't consider what you want to be doing right now. It just happens. This is another diagram, and this is really here. It's not as nice a diagram as this other one, but I want to draw your attention to some terms here, because these terms will come up again and again. You have what are called afferent nerve fibers. This diagram happens to be British. The fiber is spelled R-E instead of E-R. Don't worry about it. The word here is afferent that you want to focus on. And afferent neurons carry information from the body toward the central nervous system. So they're going to be sensory neurons. But that's what afferent means, generally, carrying information toward the CNS. And that's in contrast to efferent, sometimes pronounced efferent, neurons, which carry information from the CNS out to the body. Now, these words can be confusing because there's only one letter difference. There's an A for afferent, and there's an E in efferent. But you need to pay attention to that. So afferent toward the central nervous system, efferent away from the central nervous system. So just keep that in mind. So we have the classic knee-jerk response. And we have that idea that these reflexes are inflexible. You can't do much about them. But new information suggests that our reflexes are actually a little more context dependent than we thought. We have some control over them in a sense. And so this is the idea that reflexes adapt, that they do depend on context to a certain degree. How does this work? Well, this is a really clever experiment where you have someone who's squatting down and they're holding on to a handle with their left hand. And in one version of the experiment, they're bracing themselves against the table with their other hand, with their right hand. Suddenly, the handle moves away from them, so they're pulled forward. And the person reflexively pushes on the table to brace themselves. This is in contrast to the other version of the experiment, where you have the left hand again holding the handle, same setup there, but now the right hand is holding a coffee cup filled with coffee that you don't want to spill. Now the handle moves forward, the person is jerked forward, but the person doesn't push out with the right hand. They will relax their right arm and let the coffee move toward them so that it doesn't spill. If you pushed forward, all the coffee would slosh out of the cup. But you want to keep that cup relatively still to keep it from spilling. And so when you're pulled forward, you relax that right arm so that the cup comes toward you a little bit so that it's relatively motionless. Now this happens too fast to involve the brain, right? It's too quick for a signal to be sent to the spinal cord, up to the brain, get processed, go back down to the spinal cord, and then out to the muscles. So we know the brain is not involved in deciding whether to push or pull with that right arm. However, obviously the context here is making a difference in what happens with the motor output. The person's in the same position, the sensory stimulus is the same, being pulled by the left hand, and yet in one case they push on the table, and in the other case they pull on the cup. So we know that there must be some sort of signal coming down from the brain that's just being sent all the time in case a reflex needs to kick in. Effectively, the brain is just constantly saying, hey, if we're pulled forward, push against that table. Or, hey, if we're pulled forward, pull that coffee cup in case it happens. So there's information being sent out to the spinal cord so that if this reflex is activated, the context can have an impact. Again, it's not that information is getting sent up to the brain saying, hey, we're being pulled. The brain processes it, says, okay, well, now based on the situation, here's what you should do. It's too quick for the brain to be involved like that. So the brain is just always sending information about context so that if a reflex does occur, it can take that context into account. So there's information always being sent down to the spinal cord that can affect what reflex is implemented. A similar experiment, you have somebody tapping the index finger and the thumb of one of their hands. And if there's a little loop around the thumb and the thumb is suddenly jerked down, unbeknownst to the participant, they will still bring their index finger and thumb together. Now, again, this happens too quickly for the brain to be involved, and so what's happening is that the brain is basically sending information all the time about the context of that thumb's position, and then the spinal cord can use that information, because it always has it, to make sure reflexively that the forefinger and the thumb come into contact. So, all that is to say that that old view of reflexes being inflexible isn't really accurate anymore. They're certainly quick, and they don't involve the brain. Those things are still true. But we know information is coming from the brain to put those reflexes into context and to make the best response based on the situation, and still be very quick like a reflex should be. Another small note about this. So we have these two diagrams. We've seen these before. These are from the knee-jerk response. If you look, I've already drawn your attention to that sort of lollipop portion of the sensory neuron. That is the cell body. And we already know from our unit on neurons that neurons come in different shapes. We have names for those shapes. So in this case, that sensory neuron is a unipolar neuron. It has a cell body in the middle, but it just has one little projection that comes off and branches into dendrites and an axon. So there's just one projection off of the cell body. It is therefore unipolar. And that's what the little lollipop portion of that top diagram represents. It represents the cell body. We see it in this diagram as well. That little circle on top is the cell body sticking off of that unipolar neuron. And that brings us back to the diagram on the spinal cord. I've already mentioned the dorsal root ganglion. The dorsal root ganglion is the collection of cell bodies for those unipolar neurons. So you have a bunch of dendrites in sensory organs carrying information toward the spinal cord. It goes past the cell bodies. The cell bodies are housed in that root ganglion. And then the axons go into the spinal cord. So that's why that root ganglion exists. It is a bunch of cell bodies for sensory neurons, and they are unipolar neurons. So hopefully that all makes more sense now, why we have that root ganglion, what an example of a unipolar neuron is. So we have that dorsal root ganglion that we see labeled again here, that is, again, the collection of those cell bodies. So reflexes, going to go back to reflexes, come in a couple different kinds. Monosynaptic are really simple. And these are things like the patellar reflex. And here again, we have those afferent neurons, the sensory neurons, that synapse directly on the efferent ones. So there's just two neurons involved. This happens to be a different reflex. This is like the knee jerk, but it's if you tap the tendon in your upper arm, your lower arm will jerk forward, just like your lower leg will jerk forward if you tap the tendon below your knee. So this is sort of the analogous reflex for the arm. And here you have a sensory neuron that sends signals about the status of the bicep, and it synapses on the motor neuron that contracts the biceps, and then if that tendon is tapped, the muscle lengthens. To keep it from getting too stretched out, those muscles contract. Very simple reflex. But you can have more complex reflexes, and these are known as polysynaptic. And this is a more complex situation, so you need a more complex response. So imagine you're standing up, and your knees are kind of bent, and you either, with your right foot, either step on a tack, or there's sort of a sharp sensation, a sharp, painful sensation on the front of your leg. As a reflex, you will withdraw that leg. You will bend it so that it's not in contact with that painful stimulus anymore. But you've got a problem because you were standing up and you've just withdrawn one of your legs. If you don't do anything to adapt, you will fall over. But you don't fall over. You have a reflex that keeps you upright. But it involves multiple muscle groups on both sides of the body. Now we're beyond that simple knee-jerk response. And now we're going to involve those interneurons. So interneurons, functionally, are neurons that convey information from one neuron to another. We've talked about sensory neurons that convey information from a sense organ We've talked about motor neurons that have axon terminals on a muscle. So talking to sense organs, talking to muscles. Interneurons are neurons that just talk to other neurons. And so we have them here in this polysynaptic reflex. So when you get that sharp sensation, to withdraw the right leg, you need to contract the hamstring and relax the quadriceps, the muscle on top of the thigh. And we've already seen that happen. That's sort of the opposite of the knee-jerk response. Instead of kicking the leg out, you'll bring the leg in. So far, so good. But again, to stay upright, to keep from falling, your other leg, in this case your left leg, needs to take all of your weight. So you need to put more force through that thigh. You need to contract the quadriceps on the other side. Well, now you need to send a motor signal to the opposite side of the body. So there are neurons that cross the spinal cord and cause the quadriceps to contract, the hamstring to relax. And so now your left leg is taking more weight. It's exerting more force to keep you upright. And so you need interneurons to do that. And we can see from this diagram, this is more complicated. You're now involving 4 muscles on 2 sides of the body. It involves more processing. And again, you're crossing over. You need more neurons. So that's what interneurons are for. And your brain is almost entirely interneurons. Your brain doesn't have a whole lot of neurons that are sensory neurons or that are motor neurons. It's almost all neurons talking to other neurons. And this lets you coordinate responses across the body, which is very important. And so this is one example of that kind of reflex. Okay, so that is the structure of the spinal cord, the peripheral nervous system. Now, I've already mentioned what happens when you have a spinal cord injury in terms of loss of sensation, loss of motor control. And as we've said, that depends on where the injury has occurred. But looking smaller scale, what happens when the spinal cord or a nerve is injured? How does it get repaired? Does it get repaired at all? And so if a neuron has an axon and it is cut, if you do it intentionally, that is called an axotomy, slicing of the axon. A couple things happen. So first, what we call distal, that means the far away, axonal stump degenerates. So this is a sort of standard run-of-the-mill neuron. It's multipolar, it has multiple dendrites, it has a cell body. But if we remember our unit on the structure of the neuron, the cell body is what has the nucleus. It's what has a lot of the machinery for controlling and maintaining the neuron. If you cut that axon, everything on the axon terminal side, it doesn't have anything to maintain it. It doesn't have all the machinery that the cell body has. And so it's kind of cut off from its supply of new proteins, nutrients, that kind of thing. And so it doesn't have any way to be maintained. And so it degenerates, it dies. And then the proximal side, the near side, the cell body undergoes some changes. It usually survives, but what we're going to see here is that it doesn't necessarily regrow that axon, and even if it does, it may not go to the same place anymore. So we have a questionable survival of this neuron, or at least whether it will keep doing what it used to be doing. So we have loss of this axon. You'll often have just sort of a stump where the axon used to be. And now I've drawn this box around the microglia. If we remember our unit on glia, here's an example. The microglia is coming in, and we're going to see that the glia have an important role to play here. So we remember this diagram from your textbook. We have astrocytes, we have microglia. I'm not going to go back over all of the glial cells, just these 2 for now. So the astrocytes, if we recall, control things like blood flow. They can modulate signaling in the neuron. They form the blood-brain barrier. And so they have a protective role for the nervous system. And the microglia have another protective role. They're sort of the immune response. So the peripheral nervous system is pretty good at healing itself. Not perfect. No system of the body is perfect at healing itself. But if the damage is fairly minor, or even almost major, it can heal itself. The central nervous system is a different story. So remember Santiago Ramon y Cajal, one of the first, if not arguably the first neuroscientist, and he wrote that everything may die, nothing may be regenerated when it comes to the central nervous system. He observed that when you injure the central nervous system, it does not grow back. It does not recover. And so here you have a diagram from a different book. On the left, we have the peripheral nervous system, and on the right, we have the central nervous system. So on the left, the PNS, if that axon is cut, it can regrow. And it can, in fact, regrow back through the myelin that used to cover it. So it sort of follows the exact same pathway. And we see here that the myelin, if we recall, this is some more about glial cells, in the PNS, the myelin is generated by Schwann cells. In the CNS, it's generated by oligodendrocytes. And those names are not just because they occur in the PNS or the CNS. It turns out that the oligodendrocyte myelin seems to prevent regrowth of that axon. And so there's something different about Schwann cells and oligodendrocytes beyond just where you find them. There's something different about the myelin they generate because the CNS doesn't regenerate and the PNS does. In addition, in the central nervous system, you have these glial cells, astrocytes, microglia. And if the CNS is injured, astrocytes and microglia are just found in the central nervous system, they will swarm the site of the injury and form what's called a glial scar. So the glial scar is impossible for the axon to get through. So as scar tissue is tough, that is the point of scar tissue. And while it forms a protective layer and prevents further injury, prevents pathogens from getting in, germs, it also means the axon can't grow through it. And so you sort of protected against further injury and infection at the cost of never growing that axon back again. So that damage is usually permanent. Now, that was the view, just sort of like reflexes, that was the view for a long time. We're learning now that that may be changeable. We may be able to do something about that through therapy. And so that's a big area of research is the regeneration of the central nervous system. And people often quote Ramon y Cajal on the everything may die, nothing may be regenerated front. But they often forget the next part of that quote, which is, it is for the science of the future to change this harsh decree, which is just his way of saying, hopefully we can do something about this soon. And so that is an active area of research. We know that glia are involved. We know that oligodendrocytes are involved. And hopefully we can stop whatever part of that process prevents axon regrowth without interfering with the protective parts of this response. And so one of the early question here, when people notice that the PNS regenerates, the CNS doesn't, the question is whether it's the environment or the neurons themselves. Why don't they grow back? So as I've already noted, if you have a peripheral nervous system on the left and the central nervous system on the right we have the part of the optic nerve in this case. On the left is just a general motor neuron. Normally, if you cut a peripheral nerve, it grows back, as we see on the left. If you cut the optic nerve, it doesn't. It just stops right where it is. So they did a clever experiment where they sort of swapped things. They cut a peripheral nerve, but then put it right in front of myelin from a central nerve, the optic nerve. And they did the opposite for the optic nerve. They cut the optic nerve, and they connected it to myelin from the peripheral nervous system. So if it's the nerves that are different, the neurons, then you would expect the same thing as before. The peripheral nerve should grow back, the optic nerve wouldn't. But that's not what you see. Now, when the peripheral nerve tries to grow back through the myelin that's transplanted from the central nervous system, it doesn't go anywhere. However, the optic nerve is able to regenerate as long as it's going through myelin that's been transplanted from the peripheral nervous system. So there's something about that myelin environment, as we saw on the previous slide. So it makes a big difference. So it's not the neurons themselves that we have to change. It's whatever is in that myelin environment that encourages regrowth in the peripheral nervous system, but prevents it in the central. This is a slide we've seen before. So we know that myelin's important. No one's going to argue against that. Obviously, you want it. It insulates transmission. It makes things faster via a mechanism we'll see soon. Here's our diagram of the electron micrograph. And we know, for example, that when myelin degrades, you have negative effects like multiple sclerosis. So you have impaired transmission of motor signals, and that impairs motor function. So you want myelin. Myelin is a net benefit, even though it seems to inhibit regrowth. And again, that may be a protective influence. One other reason that you may want to prevent axon regrowth is you don't want nerves just growing all the time, going everywhere. That would seriously damage your functionality. And so it may be the case that this myelinated environment in the central nervous system prevents regrowth, sure, but it also prevents random growth by neurons. Okay, so we know that myelin is good. We want to have myelin around. We certainly want myelin in our central nervous system, in our brain and spinal cord. That being said, they've done an experiment in mice. And if you take the spinal cord, we see here on the left, normal spinal cord, if it is injured, if the axons are damaged, what we see here in the middle column is that it doesn't really grow back very much. However, in the right, we see a spinal cord that has been irradiated so that it never grew myelin. So there's no myelin in this spinal cord. It's still part of the central nervous system. So if it had myelin, it would be of the central nervous system variety. But because it's been altered, there's no myelin here. And now, if an injury occurs, the axons grow back. So again, there are reasons that you might not want sort of rapid growth of axons all over the place. But the cost of that, the downside, is that if an injury occurs, you don't get regrowth even when you want it. So that's what we know about repair of the central nervous system and why it seems to be inhibited in most cases. And again, hopefully in the near future, we're going to make some progress on being able to specifically and in a systematic way repair the central nervous system without allowing for infection. We don't want to shut down glial cells, and without allowing for random growth by neurons. We don't want that either. But appropriate growth to the former targets of neurons would be a good thing to be able to regain. Okay, that will do it for this lecture. Next time, we're going to talk about a research article. So I've already posted it. Be sure to read it. And this is really critically important. Do not wait until class time to become familiar with this article. You want to read it at least once before you come to class. Otherwise, our discussion will be very hard to follow. So be sure to read that article. Do it before class. And come prepared to discuss it. If you have questions, that's great. If you have a point you'd like to make, that's also great. And we're going to go over the article, but I'm going to check whether you've read it or not. So come prepared to discuss it, to answer questions, to ask questions, and to talk about the larger implication of this article. So be sure to do that, and I will see you then.